previous attendance record at Copacabana Beach, which had been set by the Rolling Stones in 1996. And let me tell you, from a media point of view, anytime you can craft a sentence that has both the Pope and Mick Jagger in it, you're really onto something. But the vignette I want to give you was not from those massive events at the end. It was from Thursday of that week, when Francis went to downtown in Rio to the cathedral, ostensibly to meet with a group of youth from Argentina, but of course plenty of other people showed up for the event. And I was there when the Pope-mobile pulled up to the cathedral. There was this group of Latin American nuns, okay, off to the side, a couple hundred of them, who, when the Pope-mobile got there, started shrieking as if they were teenage girls at a Justin Bieber concert, okay, and stormed the Pope-mobile, okay, and basically wrapped the Pope in a warm, loving embrace. Now, the Brazilians had deployed like 20,000 soldiers and cops to prevent this kind of mob scene, and they were all just standing there watching this happen. So I pulled one of them aside and I said, "Hey, what's going on? I mean, aren't you supposed to prevent this kind of thing?" And the guy looked at me and said, "Look at me. I've got ammo strapped across my chest. I'm wearing a combat helmet. I am not going to be the guy caught on YouTube beating up a nun." They can do whatever they want, you know? That was the feel of those days. I mean, it really had the sense of a kind of, wildly charismatic global figure taking the stage by storm. All right, that's popular appeal. Let's talk about media appeal. Again, many other things I could say here, but here's my favorite example of the kind of dynamism and the charm that Francis seems to be wielding in terms of the global media. Do you realize that in early June, June, Francis was named the Man of the Year by the Italian edition of Vanity Fair magazine. Vanity Fair, folks. This is not an archdiocesan paper someplace. Okay? Not exactly a house organ of the Catholic Church. The write-up included laudatory quotes from a number of different people, including Elton John, who described the new pope as an island of humility in a sea of vanity. Okay? Two things about that really struck me. One, again, early June, the guy had been pope basically 2.5 months, okay, and yet they had already decided he was worthy of this honor. The other thing that was really striking, June, there were 7 months left to go in the year, okay? This was like an American Little League baseball game when somebody applied the 10-run rule, okay? We decided the other team was getting embarrassed, and so we were going to call the contest here. They had decided that Francis had already done enough in those 2 months that no other competitor for the Man of the Year designation could possibly, catch up. I think that speaks volumes about the climate of opinion regarding this new pope in the mainstream press. Finally, let me say something about his impact in the culture in Rome. Now again, many different ways I could sort of lift this up to you, but let me give you my favorite. Immediately after Francis's election, I went down to Argentina and spent a good part of April there to get the backstory on the new pope. At the end of that, I came back to Rome, and I was at a restaurant in the Roman neighborhood of Trastevere. And if you know Rome at all, there's a kind of satellite Vatican at the Piazza San Callisto in Trastevere. A number of the pontifical councils have their offices there. So I was out at a restaurant that a lot of Vatican people eat at. I was with a couple guys from the Council for the Family that I know. And at some point during the meal, this veteran Italian cardinal, who I've known for a long time, the guy has been there since the dawn of time, okay? I mean, honestly, I think he got his red hat from Pius XI, okay? That's how long he's been around. He comes into the restaurant, and normally this guy really looks the part, I mean, lots of ecclesiastical finery and regalia and all of this stuff. But this particular night, he was dressed in a very simple black clergyman outfit, and so when he came over to our table to say hello, I kind of jokingly brought up his much simpler appearance, and I said, Your Eminence, what's up? I mean, you're just dressed very differently tonight. And he looked at me, and I think this probably ought to be printed on T-shirts someplace, okay? He looked at me and he said, "John, what you must understand is that with this pope, simple is the new chic." That's the Francis effect on the culture. So, I mean, as I say, we could go on multiplying these examples. The point simply is that, Francis has sort of taken not only the world, but taken the church by storm, and all indications are that the earthquake is only beginning. This is going to be a fascinating story to watch as it unfolds. Now, that said, we also all know from our own experience that popes are not the only actors in the Catholic drama. There's a much more complicated cast of characters out there. And we also know that what any pope can do is, to some extent, conditioned by the circumstances they inherit when they take over. Circumstances within the church, circumstances external to the church. So what I'd like to do with you here tonight is talk about some of those circumstances and try to see them through the eyes of a global church rather than restricting our focus to kind of domestic American perspective. So I'm going to give you first a basic observation about Catholic demography in the early 21st century. Then I'm going to take two sort of core issues in American Catholic life, that is, two what have become kind of idées fixes in American Catholicism, and try to see how looking at them through a global perspective might change the way we think about them. Okay? And then I'll end with a final thought, and we'll see what you want to talk about from there. First, basic observation about Catholic demography. Ladies and gentlemen, in our day, we are living through the most sweeping, most dramatic, most profound transformation of the Catholic population in more than 2,000 years of church history. It is happening right now. Let me give you two snapshots of the global Catholic population at two different moments in time. In 1900, at the dawn of the 20th century, there were a total of 266 million Catholics in the world, of whom 200 million lived in Europe and North America. Just 66 million everywhere else. They were principally in Latin America. This, of course, was before the population explosion of the 20th century. Okay? In other words, just over 100 years ago, the ethnic and demographic profile of the Catholic Church was basically what it had been at the time of the Council of Trent. We were an overwhelmingly white, first world family of faith. Let's roll the clock forward to the end of the 20th century, the year 2000. By that stage, there were 1.1 billion Catholics in the world, of whom 740 million lived in the developing world, outside the West: Africa, Asia, Latin America, Oceania, the Middle East. The remainder living in Europe and North America. Another way of putting that point is that just 100 years ago, 2/3 of the Catholic population lived in the West. 100 years later, 2/3 of the Catholic population lived outside the West. And if we project to the middle of this century, by the year 2050, the projection is that the southern share, that is the share living in the southern hemisphere, will be 3/4. Within the arc of our lifetimes, basically, 3 out of every 4 Catholic men, women, and children alive will be living in the developing world, outside the West. Again, a stunning, stunning transformation. And what this means is that as the 21st century unfolds, places like Jakarta and Mumbai and Manila and Buenos Aires are destined to be, in our era, what Paris and Louvain and Milan were in the 15th and 16th centuries, the primary centers of new theological interest, new pastoral leadership, new momentum in the church. Okay? Now, there are two corollaries to that I'd like to unpack for American audiences. Okay? One, let's do some basic math. As of today, September 30th, 2013, there are, according to the Annuario, that's the Vatican Statistical Yearbook, there are 1.25 billion baptized Roman Catholics in the world. And there are slightly under 70 million baptized Roman Catholics in the United States. What that means, ladies and gentlemen, is that we American Catholics are roughly 6% of the global Catholic population. 6%. Put another way, 94% of the Catholics in the world aren't necessarily like us. And by the way, if you ever wonder why the Pope is not thinking American thoughts when he gets out of bed in the morning, this might have something to do with it. You know? It's a much bigger and more complicated church out there. Bottom line is this, if I can put this in a soundbite. If you want to think intelligently about the Catholic, if you want to think about the Catholic Church at all in the 21st century, you really only have two choices. One, you can think globally. Two, you can think dysfunctionally. Okay, I'm sorry to tell you, those are the only two items on the menu. Okay? That's corollary one. Corollary two, if you want to experience this wildly diverse, polychrome, multicultural Catholic Church that I'm talking about, You don't have to go to the four corners of the earth to find it. You don't have to book the next plane flight to Timbuktu. All you have to do, ladies and gentlemen, is walk out the door of this hall. Because increasingly, the Catholic Church in the United States is, in miniature, a fairly faithful reflection of the burgeoning diversity of the global church. Consider that according to the recent Pew Forum study on the religious landscape in America, that by around the year 2040, we are going to enter a watershed moment in American Catholic life in which white Catholics are no longer a statistical majority of the American Catholic population. White Catholics will be a plurality at around 45% or so, but Hispanics, that is Latinos, Latinas, will be about 40%. Asians and Asian Americans will be 8 to 10%. Africans and African Americans will be 3 to 4%. We are, in other words, living in a global church, both on the world stage and also what is brewing in our own backyard. And therefore, thinking through the implications of the rise of this global church isn't just an abstract gesture of solidarity with Catholics in other places, but it's about trying to get ready to minister and move and have our being in the Catholic Church that is coming into being here in the United States in our own home. Okay? All right, that's the broad observation about the rise of a world church. Now, let me take two core themes, two key ideas in recent Catholic life that have come to assume a kind of mammoth importance in American Catholic life, and try to suggest what thinking globally about these trajectories would mean in terms of how we might approach them differently. Let's start with what today in Catholic Argot goes under the heading of the new evangelization. Okay, the new evangelization, which unquestionably has become the highest internal priority of the Catholic Church, beginning in the John Paul years, extending through the reign of Benedict, certainly set in stone by the American Catholic bishops as their driving internal priority. Now, I was saying at dinner tonight, I have covered synods of bishops on the new evangelization. I have reviewed books on the new evangelization. I have gone to more speeches than I can count devoted to the new evangelization. And if you put a gun to my head, I'm not sure I could give you a working definition of what exactly it's supposed to mean. But that said, in big picture terms, it is about the effort to kind of relight the missionary fires of the Catholic Church, to engineer a shift from maintenance to mission. That is, from defining the priorities of Catholic life in terms of sustaining the institutions that we have built over the years, to seeing those institutions as subsidiary to the core purpose of the church, which of course is to invite people into the discipleship with Jesus Christ and to transform the world from the inside out. That's the big picture. Now, how do you get there? How do you get to a more evangelical church? Well, I would suggest that looked at through American, or perhaps more broadly, looked at through Western eyes, in recent years in the life of the church, the key to eliciting a more missionary church has often been seen in terms of trying to hold the line against secularism and the fear of kind of secular inroads in the church watering down our notion of the distinctiveness of what it means to be Catholic. And so that has meant a kind of tight focus in the church in the West on matters of Catholic identity. Okay, trying to revive those traditional markers of Catholic thought, Catholic speech, Catholic practice that over the centuries have set us apart from the rest of the world and told us who we are. So at a very banal, sort of simplistic level, I'm talking about things like priests wearing Roman collars, members of religious orders wearing the habit, Eucharistic adoration, Marian devotion, all of those things that in a way kind of went out of fashion in the years immediately after the Second Vatican Council, but today, over the last 25 years, have quite clearly been staging a comeback. And all of that understood as a kind of way of giving us a thick, meaty sense of Catholic identity so that we do not become assimilated to and seduced by the kind of secular ethos in which we live. In practical terms, what this has meant is that in the Church in the West, tensions and sometimes battles over Catholic identity have become a defining feature of our life. And certainly you people at Notre Dame do not need me to tell you where these battles over Catholic identity can sometimes lead us. Okay, but wherever you stand in those battles, descriptively, I think we can say, these tensions around identity have become a core feature of Catholic life. Okay? Now, what does all this look like in global terms? Well, what I would suggest is that in most other parts of the Catholic world, this effort to promote a more missionary church is not understood in the first place as a kind of ideological rivalry with secularism. Okay? And this is because in most parts of the developing world, to be honest, outside of very rarefied elite environments, you have to look pretty long and pretty hard to find an honest-to-God secularist. Okay, if we define that as somebody who has kind of, in principle, made a decision against religious faith and practice, okay, that's what we mean by a secularist. They are not particularly common outside the West. In fact, in most parts of the developing world, the option for religious belief is taken for granted. And so their realities are shaped not by this rivalry between religion and secularism. They're shaped by the competitive dynamics of a flourishing religious marketplace. Okay? Let's take Latin America, where, of course, Pope Francis comes from, where he put in 15 years as the Archbishop of Buenos Aires and played a leadership role in the Latin American Bishops' Conference. Probably the single greatest story about religion in Latin America over the last 35 years is the transition in Latin America from basically a homogeneously Catholic continent, okay, where the continent-wide average was that people were 96-97% Catholic, to being kind of the Wild West of religion, an extraordinarily competitive and fluid marketplace. Do you know that more people converted from Catholicism to Protestantism in Latin America in the last 35 years, mostly to evangelical and Pentecostal forms of Protestantism, more people in the last 35 years converted from Catholicism to Protestantism in Latin America than did so in Europe in the entire century following the Protestant Reformation? Okay. The Catholic bishops of Latin America and Ceylon did a study in the mid-1990s in which they concluded they were losing 8,000 people a day. That's 7 days a week, 365 days a year. 8,000 people a day, primarily to the Pentecostals. Okay? It is the most dramatic religious realignment, in several generations. Okay? That is the pastoral reality that bishops across the developing world find themselves, and not just bishops, theologians, lay activists, pastors, rank-and-file Catholics, ordinary people in the pews. These are the realities they find themselves up against. So for them, this notion of the new evangelization isn't about fighting intellectual or ideological battles against the secular menace. Okay? It's about a very practical, pragmatic, sleeves rolled up effort to make the church present and relevant once again in people's lives so that they feel that their spiritual and pastoral needs can be met within the Catholic fold and they don't have to take their business someplace else. Okay? Probably the single phrase most associated with then Cardinal Bergoglio, now Pope Francis, with his tenure in Buenos Aires it's now become famous. This mantra that the church has to get out of the sacristy and into the street. Okay? That if it stays in the sacristy too long, breathing the stale air in that environment, it's going to get sick, that to be healthy it has to be out in the street. What's in the background of that comment? It's this. Okay? It's the understanding that the old model of if you build it, they will come, that is, all we have to do is open the doors of the church on Sunday and people will automatically show up because that's what centuries of cultural conditioning have programmed them to do, that doesn't work anymore. And we have to be present in the favelas and the barrios and the slums where people live and where they experience their real human crises and struggles and agonies. We have to be present to them there. That's what being missionary in the 21st century means. Okay? And that, I think, is what the new evangelization, looked at through a global perspective, would mean. Less emphasis on fighting wars of culture against a threatening secular world, more on the very practical effort to make the church present to people where they live and make sure that they understand that we want to walk with them in their journey. All right? Let's take a second issue. Religious freedom. I don't think there is any serious question that the Catholic bishops of the United States have cemented the effort to defend America's tradition of religious liberty, religious freedom, as their towering social and political priority of this time. Okay? And of course, the symbolic expression of that would be the high-stakes tug-of-war that the Catholic bishops of this country have been involved in with the Obama White House over the contraception mandates imposed as part of the process of health care reform. Okay? So when we think about, when we American Catholics think about religious liberty, we are often thinking about church-state battles, like the contraception mandates, that are waged largely in courthouses and in legislatures and on the op-ed pages of newspapers. They mostly have to do with the ability of faith-based institutions in this country to be true both to their religious beliefs and also to play a vibrant public role. Okay? In other words, we are fighting a metaphorical war against religion. Okay? Whether you think there actually is a war or not is another question, but even if there is, we would all agree that it's a metaphorical one. Here's how the religious freedom issue looks through global eyes. Okay? The truth, ladies and gentlemen, is that there may be a metaphorical war against religion underway in the West, but there is a decidedly literal war against religion underway in many other parts of the world in which Christians are often the primary victims. Or, to give it to you in another soundbite, in the United States, a threat to your religious freedom means that you might get sued. In many global neighborhoods, a threat to your religious freedom means that you might get shot. And I hope we would all agree that that rate's slightly higher on the urgency meter. Huh? Let me give you 3 statistical insights into the world in which we live vis-a-vis religious freedom. 1, according to the International Society for Human Rights, which is a secular NGO devoted to human rights issues in Frankfurt, Germany, so not a church outfit, a secular NGO. According to that body, 80% of the acts of religious persecution in the world today are directed against Christians. That's 80%. Statistically speaking, Christians are by far, by some order of magnitude, the most persecuted religious body on the planet today. Second, according to the Pew Forum, again, not a church outfit, but the most respected think tank on religion and public policy in D.C. According to the Pew Forum, between the years 2006 and 2010, Christians face some form of persecution, either de jure or de facto, in a staggering total of 139 countries. And bear in mind, the United Nations only recognizes 193, so that means Christians face some form of persecution in almost 3/4 of all societies on earth. By far the highest total for any religious body. And in the most bone-chilling bit of data of all, according to the Center for the Study of Global Christianity at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, a Protestant outfit in Massachusetts, which is the only serious academic center devoted to the study of martyrdom. According to the Center for the Study of Global Christianity, on average, throughout the last decade, 100,000 Christians have been killed every year somewhere in this world for motives related to their faith. 100,000 new martyrs every year for each year of the past decade. What that means, folks, is that in roughly the hour we are going to be together here tonight, somewhere in this world, 11 Christians are losing their lives. We are, in effect, witnessing the rise of an entire new generation of Christian martyrs. This, I would submit to you, is the most dramatic Christian narrative of our time, and in many ways it's the most untold Christian story of our time. Now, if you want to put flesh and blood in those statistics, all you really need to do is open your eyes. I mean, in the last week, of course, we have seen church bombings in Pakistan and Kenya. We know that in Syria, tens of thousands of Christians are currently in refugee status. Thousands have been killed. Some just gripped by the broader violence in the country, but some specifically targeted for their faith. If you want the emblematic case, look at the church in Iraq. Okay, this is a church that just 2 decades ago, a little bit more than 2 decades ago, in 1981, at the time of the first Gulf War, had an estimated 1.5 to 2 million Christians. It was the second largest Christian community anywhere in the Middle East. Today, the high-end estimate for the number of Christians left in Iraq is about 400,000. Realistically, a lot of people think it's closer to 200 or 250,000. And this, by the way, is a church that can trace its roots back to the era of the apostles. So a church that took 2 millennia to construct has been gutted in basically the arc of 2 decades. If you want a concrete example of what's been happening, I would direct you to the siege of the Church of Our Lady of Salvation in downtown Baghdad on October 31st, 2010. Now, in itself, the fact the church was bombed that day is no novelty. Unfortunately, of the 65 Christian churches in Baghdad, 43 of them have been bombed at least once since 2003. But what followed was unusual, because what followed was armed Islamic gunmen stormed the church. They killed the priest who was saying Mass. They killed the 2 deacons assisting him. They killed 33 other people, leaving 36 dead. And they held the church for 4 hours until the Iraqi Defense Forces show up to liberate it. Now, I've had the chance to interview one of the survivors of that siege, a young Chaldean Catholic woman by the name of Fatima, who is now living in Rome. She was singing in the choir that day. The choir mate to her right and the choir mate to her left were both shot dead. The way she survived was by falling to the floor and pulling their bodies over her and playing dead for the agonizing 4 hours it took for someone to come to her aid, thinking any moment one of these guys was going to come by to deliver the coup de grace. As I say, she's now in Rome, and she is devoting her every waking moment to trying to help her fellow Christians get out of Iraq, because she's profoundly convinced they have no future there. Now, I mean, one hopes she's wrong, but it is impossible to fault the experience and the reasoning that's led her to that conclusion. That, in miniature, ladies and gentlemen, that's what a real threat to religious freedom looks like. And increasingly, these are the kinds of threats that our Christian brothers and sisters, our Catholic sisters and brothers, all across the developing world in particular, are facing. You say religious freedom to a Catholic in the United States, they may think the Obama administration and the HHS mandates. You say religious freedom to Catholics in most other parts of the world, and this is the kind of stuff that they think about. Okay? And increasingly, the effort to engage that kind of religious freedom struggle, to mount a defense of Christians whose lives are literally in the balance, that is going to become, I think, the kind of signature social and political concern of the Catholic Church in the 21st century. You can already see this. Pope Francis, last Wednesday, September 25th, devoted his general audience in St. Peter's Square to the topic of unity in the Church. And his leading example of the need for unity was precisely the need to mount a unified witness in defense of persecuted Christians around the world. There was this pointed moment in that general audience when he said, I'm going to ask you a question, and I don't want anyone here to shout out an answer, because he knows these audiences are often like a high school pep rally, right? And, the people go nuts. But he said, this time, I don't want anyone to shout out an answer. I want you to ponder it in your hearts. And then he said, when you hear reports of persecuted Christians, do you pray for that person? Do you take it to heart? Or does it not affect you? It's because the truth is, we all have to think bigger than our own backyards. We have to feel ourselves as members of one global church. And we have to own the idea, I'm paraphrasing here, but we have to own the idea that the suffering of any member of the body is my suffering too. That we have to feel when we hear about a Christian being persecuted that that's my brother, my sister, in the firing line. I think the effort to carry that argument forward, that's going to become the kind of core of what Francis means and what the global church means when it talks about religious freedom. And it's going to require some stretching on our part, I think, in the United States to adjust our own understanding of what a defense of religious freedom means, to think beyond our domestic difficulties towards the much more harrowing and much more urgent challenges faced by our sisters and brothers in the faith elsewhere. Okay? All right, well, let me give you one last thought, and then we'll see what you want to talk about. Last thought is this. I realize that what I've just sketched is a somewhat challenging, and it can be in some ways a kind of intimidating vision of what's going on in the church. I mean, we have to navigate the challenge to, a global church with bewildering complexity. We have to think through what evangelization means. We have to come to the aid of Christians who are under fire in various parts of the world, and all of that can seem daunting, right? And I would suggest to you that to respond to those challenges successfully in our time, we're going to need a kind of bushel basket of qualities of heart and mind, okay? We're going to need persistence, and we're going to need fidelity, and we're going to need creativity, and we're going to need imagination. We're going to need a new spirit of unity if we're going to be able to project past our kind of antique divisions and come together to respond successfully to these challenges. So we're going to need lots of qualities. But let me give you one other quality of heart and mind I am 100% convinced has to be in the mix if we are going to mount a successful Catholic response to these challenges. And that quality of heart and mind, ladies and gentlemen, is a lively sense of humor. Because if we are not able to occasionally laugh at our circumstances and laugh at ourselves, given the mind-numbing challenges we face, we're going to spend a good part of this century sort of fighting down heartburn, right? And the happy news I want to leave you with is that you can often find this lively sense of humor in the church, even in the most wildly improbable places. I'm going to tell you one last story to drive that point home, and then we'll be done. You may remember that April 2005 was kind of a busy time in the Vatican newsbeat, right? I mean, we had the death of John Paul II and the election of Benedict XVI and all of that. It was like last March, it was one of those rare moments when the eyes of the whole world were kind of on the Catholic Church, right? Now, you all are media-savvy Americans enough to know that if there is one thing that follows a major news event as surely as night follows day, it is that there will be a cottage industry of Instabooks looking to cash in on all that interest, right? And the way I know that, ladies and gentlemen, in particular, is that in 2005, I participated in that cottage industry. I produced my own Instabook called The Rise of Benedict XVI, okay? Now, there is a tradition in the Vatican Press Corps that when one of us writes a book about the Holy Father, we inscribe a copy to him, and then we give it either to his priest secretary or to his spokesperson to be passed along to the Pope, right? Now, to be honest with you, it had never entered my mind for a nanosecond that the Pope would actually read these books, okay? I mean, in my mind's eye, I had pictured a box in the basement of the Apostolic Palace, right, where they all kind of gather dust. But, you know, Benedict is elected in April. I write my book in May. It comes out June 1. So I dutifully inscribe a copy to Benedict. And then I, of course, who I'd known, of course, over the years at the Vatican. And I gave a copy of this book to Joaquin Navarro-Valls, a Spanish layman who at the time was still his press spokesperson, and forgot about it, right? So flash forward to August. My wife and I are now back in the United States for a vacation. We're out visiting my grandma in rural western Kansas, who at the time was like 93, who lives in this little western Kansas hamlet called Hill City, which, by the way, is my candidate for the worst place name in America because there is no hill and there sure as hell is no city. Okay? We're talking like, 700 people on a good day, all right? But there we are with my grandma. And at one stage, my cell phone goes off. And, even back in 2005, right, your cell phone would tell you who's calling, right? So, I knew it was Navarro-Valls. By the way, I can't prove this to you empirically, but I am morally certain this is the first time in church history that a phone call was placed from the papal household to Graham County, Kansas. Because I can think of no other circumstances in which such a thing might have happened. But anyway, I pick up the phone, and it's Navarro-Valls, who says, well, John, I'm with the Pope on vacation. They were up in northern Italy. I'm with the Pope on vacation, and I wanted you to know that he came down this morning with your book in his hands, and he asked me to deliver to you a message. Now, I don't know about you, but if you've just been told the Pope has a personal reaction to something you've written about him, I would want to make sure your tray table is in a full upright and locked position, right? Because the skies might get a little bumpy. But so I said to Joaquin, well, that's delightful. Well, Joaquin, what's the message? Now, to get this, you need to understand, my book was divided into thirds, okay? So the first part were the final days of John Paul II. The middle part was the inside story of how Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger had been elected as Benedict XVI. And then the last part was my projections as to where his papacy was going to go, okay? So Joaquin said, the Holy Father's message is the following. Please thank Herr Dr. Allen for having written this book, particularly the last part about the future of my papacy, because it has saved me the trouble of thinking about it for myself. I like to think he was kidding. Well, on this score at least, ladies and gentlemen, I would suggest that we take our cues from the Holy Father. If we can take a clear-eyed, unflinchingly realistic look at the challenges we face today, particularly the dazzling challenges of trying to reframe our ideas about Catholic life through a global key. But if we can do all that with a twinkle in our eye rather than anger in our heart or bile in our spleen, That, ladies and gentlemen, I would suggest is a winning strategy for Catholic life every day of the week and twice on Sunday. Thank you, and God bless you. Sure. Keep those hands up. Let me just say two things before we dive in here. One is an invitation, and the other is a warning. The invitation is you're obviously welcome to ask anything you like about the presentation you just heard, but don't feel restricted to that. If there's something else you really feel you want to put on the table, that's perfectly fine. This is your dime, not mine. The warning is that I'm getting paid to stand here for the next little while, whether you have questions or not. So if you don't come up with questions, I am simply going to stand here and tell you more Pope jokes. Okay? And I promise you this is not a consummation devoutly to be wished. Okay. Example. Pope walks into a bar with a frog in his shoulder. Bartender looks up and says, "Hey, that's kind of cool. Where'd you get it?" The frog says, "Buenos Aires." See what I'm heading? Yeah.
So the main question is your sense of the future of just war thinking in the church. A professor colleague of mine said that the more he sees, not only from Francis, but before from J.P. Benedict, sort of these denunciations of violence of all sorts. And this guy's a just war guy, says he thinks that the just war is sort of dying a semi-slow death as at least in the Vatican, as a legitimate response to the problems of the human community, the use of war. And the sub-question is, just one of the people over the years who has tried to resist that in the church is an American, George Weigel. And so the question is sort of like, where in terms of global politics do you see just war thinking go? And also, what does that say about the influence now and into the future of those who are associated with, say, George Weigel?
Well, I mean, I could tell you what I think about that, which is what you actually asked, but I think it's far more interesting to know what people in the Holy See think about it, who actually craft policy, as opposed to pundits like me who comment on it. And fortunately, there is a hard empirical answer to that question, because just last week we had a press conference with the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace with Cardinal Peter Turkson, who is from Ghana, who is the president of that council, and Bishop Mario Toso, who is the secretary, the number 2 guy, who were there to present a conference on the 50th anniversary of Pacem in Terris, which is taking place in Rome in these days. And one of the questions that came up at this press conference was precisely the future of the just war theory. And what both Turkson and Toso essentially said, the answer was a little bit more complex, but it boils down to just war theory was superseded in the papacy of John Paul II by the new concept of humanitarian intervention. That is, that we no longer evaluate the moral legitimacy of conflict according to the traditional tests of just war, because in the 21st century, many of those tests, such as proportionality, the ability to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants and so forth, no longer really are applicable. We have this new conceptual repertoire of humanitarian intervention, which requires, in the first place, the initiative come from the international community rather than a single state. Secondly, that it be calculated to protect a beleaguered, an oppressed minority when aggression is already in act, and so on. So I think the answer to your question is the new framework would be humanitarian intervention rather than just war, at least as far as the Holy See is concerned. Now, this will continue to be debated by Catholic social theorists and so on, but that's the language the Vatican is using. You asked about the influence of George Weigel. Let me say, first of all, that George Weigel is a personal friend of mine who I treasure. I think he's a great guy. And in fact, here's a great George Weigel story. In Toronto in 2002, when John Paul was there for World Youth Day, remember? If you don't, the weather most of that week was just god-awful, okay? And so we're building up to the final Mass on Sunday, and it is pouring rain, and there are these, torrential winds. It's just terrible. And they had us on a TV platform, okay, above this racetrack in Toronto where the final Mass is going to take place. And so Weigel is up there doing MSNBC, I'm doing CNN. And at one stage, the winds are so bad that some guy in an orange vest with a bullhorn comes tearing up the stairs screaming, "Evacuate, evacuate," right? Now, Weigel, of course, would be seen as the captain of the neocon wing of the church. And you know, I mean, even though I like to think of myself as non-ideological, certainly the paper I write for would be seen as pretty left of center, okay? And so when this guy is yelling, evacuate, evacuate, everybody starts running down the stairs, and after about 30 seconds, the only people left on this platform are George and myself, because we've got TV bits coming up, and, you know, we're going to be damned if we're going to sacrifice our 15 minutes of fame, right? And so we're both sitting there on stools, and we realize we're the only people left, okay? And this thing is like shaking, and you kind of feel like the four horsemen of the apocalypse are right around the corner. And George turns to me and says, you realize if we die here today, it will be the ultimate proof of the Catholicity of the church. So George is a great guy. That said, you know, I think the truth of it is that on at least a couple of core, and George, I mean, I also have to say that he has been, I think, a remarkably generous interpreter of many of the things that Francis has said and done since his election, which have stretched him in new directions. But, you know, that said, on a couple of core issues, I mean, one being the moral analysis of free market capitalism, and the other being just war theory, I think it is quite clear that the views George represents are probably destined to be a kind of loyal opposition under this papacy, as opposed to being the tone-setting force. Yes?
Do you comment on any of the Pope's appointments to this point, both in the Vatican and even here?
Okay. The Pope's appointments to date, both in the Vatican and here. Well, it's easier to get rid of the thing in the States because he really hasn't made many yet. You know, Francis has been Pope for 7 months. He's only appointed 10 bishops in the United States, including just 2 archbishops, Michael Jacobs in Dubuque in April, and just the other day, Bernie Hebdes, the new coadjutor in Newark. And in none of those 10 cases, and I've done reporting on this, in none of those cases was the Pope personally involved. Okay, these were, you know, the nuncio and the members of the Congregation for Bishops sort of, you know, processing appointments through the pipeline, as was the case, you know, prior to Francis's election. So the quick answer in terms of the United States is that he really has not yet turned in earnest to naming bishops in this country. And it may be a while before he has a chance to. We were talking earlier tonight. I recently did a piece where I ran the numbers. Of the 33 archbishops in the United States, which tend to have the greatest impact on setting a national tone, the average age right now is 64.2, which means that on average it would be 10 years before Francis had an opportunity to replace them. So there are only 4 archdioceses in the States right now where the incumbent is within 2 years of retirement age. And only one of those is what we would call a red hat see, meaning a place led by a cardinal, and that's Chicago. So where Cardinal George is already 76 and turns 77 very shortly. So I think Chicago probably looms as the first major American appointment where you can detect, where I am confident Pope Francis will take a personal interest. That's the one to look for in terms of what kind of imprint he wants to put on his own crop of American bishops. In the Vatican, on the other hand, there have been a lot of dramatic appointments. You know, beginning with the fact that the Pope has named his new Secretary of State. And the Secretary of stop me if I'm giving you too much detail, but the Vatican kind of has a president-prime minister structure where the Pope is the head of state, but the Secretary of State is the head of government. Okay, so day-to-day governance tends to come out of that office. He has picked for that role an Italian archbishop by the name of Pietro Parolin. And I would read 2 things into that. One, he's getting good advice because anybody who knows Rome, who was asked to name the Vatican diplomat over the last 10 years they've dealt with who impressed them the most, I think 95% would have said Parolin. So that tells you the Pope is plugged in, even though he's an outsider to the Vatican. I mean, he's plugged in to recent experience. The other is, you know, Parolin is a pragmatic, non-ideological centrist. Where have we heard this before? You know, I mean, that pretty much is the profile of Francis's papacy, and I think he's moving people into positions of leadership who fit that. He has confirmed a number of other officials in the Vatican. He has made some changes. He took Cardinal Mauro Piacenza out of the Congregation for Clergy. Piacenza would have been seen as the most traditionalist or conservative cardinal in the Roman Curia. He has been taken out of that job, and he's been replaced with another Vatican diplomat, Beniamino Stella, Italian, and again, moderate, pragmatic, centrist. So I think that's the emerging profile of the kind of people that Francis is trying to bring into leadership. Still some things that have to be done there. He has to name new members of the Congregation for Bishops, for example. But in the main, I think he has kind of established for now the new team. The new team is top-heavy with diplomats, I think because Francis knows many of them from Latin America, and also because they tend to be very moderate and very pragmatic, and that's what Francis is looking for in leadership. And that team has kind of taken place. The one other thing I would tell you, however, is that this is a pope who is determined to be collegial in the way that he does business. That is, he's determined to sort of consult widely before making decisions. Now, he'll make the decisions himself, and that's clear. But he's determined to consult widely before doing it, which means that who heads what office in the Vatican may be slightly less important under this pope than it has been under previous ones, because he's going to be consulting with plenty of voices, including people who don't happen to live in Rome. Okay? Obviously, what's going on this week, the first meeting of the Council of 8 Cardinals from around the world that Francis tapped to advise him on governance is taking place right now, well, actually starting tomorrow. And Francis issued a legal document today making that group permanent, as a kind of permanent sounding board for consultation. In many ways, I would suggest people like Sean O'Malley from Boston, who is clearly his favorite American cardinal, Errázuriz from Chile, who is on that group, Gracias from India. Those aren't Vatican guys, but they may well have a lot more influence in terms of advising the Pope and shaping policy under this papacy than who heads what Vatican office. Yes?
Recently, the Pope has made some very nice comments about women in the church. Do you have any sense of how far this is going to go, including treatment of American women?
Well, we were talking about this at dinner, honestly, and, much like I said about the new evangelization, Francis has now said on 3 separate occasions he wants a deeper theology of women. Again, gun to my head, I'm not sure I could tell you exactly what that means, but here's what I think it means, okay? Let me start by saying that when he was the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, he had a very impressive track record in terms of trying to bring women into administrative and leadership positions in the Archdiocese. So I think he means what he says when he says he wants to listen more deeply to the voice of women. Now, it's also worth saying that on 2 different occasions now, he has also said that the door to women's ordination was conclusively shut under John Paul II, and he does not intend to revisit that question. So I think where he's coming from is what I would sort of describe as the kind of moderate or centrist Catholic position on women. Okay, the left-wing Catholic position on women is that we should repeal the ban on ordination. Okay, the right-wing Catholic position on ordination is that everything is fine. We have no women's problem. Okay, I think the moderate position is, we do have a problem. We may not be able to monkey around with the sacramental structure of the church, but, we need to do a better job of listening to women, and so they want to try to bring women into positions of leadership in every way they possibly can that doesn't require a sacramental ordination. Okay, and I think that is where Bergoglio is coming from. So it would not at all surprise me, for example, if he were to take a step that doesn't create any theological conundrum, but certainly would be important symbolism, and, for example, appoint a woman to head the Pontifical Council for Laity. I mean, why not? I mean, according to Pastor Bonus and the other, founding documents, the constitutional documents of the Roman Curia, council is different than a congregation. A congregation exercises vicarious authority in the name of the Pope, and there's an argument that you have to be in holy orders to do that. Pontifical Council doesn't, or naming a woman to run the Vatican press office, naming a woman to run the Synod of Bishops. I mean, none of these jobs require that you be in a Roman collar. There's just a kind of culture there that has said, clergy always have to have those roles. So that's the kind of thing that I would look for from Bergoglio, and we'll see where that leads. Oh, and you asked then about American nuns. Of course, that early on in his papacy, Francis authorized the release of a statement from the Congregation for the Faith saying basically that he wanted the, whatever word you want to use, crackdown, dialogue, reform, renewal, whatever, of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious to continue. And I think that process certainly will continue. On the other hand, as you know, Francis has also publicly spoken to groups of men and women religious on a couple of different times, and what he's consistently said every time is that I want you to be creative. I want you to stand in the frontiers, and I understand that may be messy. I understand you may occasionally get letters from Rome raising questions, but don't be intimidated by any of that. Continue to press forward. So I think the drama going forward is how is he going to reconcile these two things? I mean, clearly, I think he wants religious, including women religious, not to cut their ties, with officialdom, to remain in the conversation, but I think he also wants to encourage them to be creative and to explore new frontiers. I think this is one of the dramas as things unfold, but let's remember that one of his first appointments was the appointment of a new secretary for the Congregation for Religious, which is the Vatican's lead office for relationships with religious orders. And it was the Superior General of the Franciscans, Carballo, who everyone would see as very friendly to religious, including friendly to women religious, not an ideologue, somebody who wants to improve these relationships. Okay? So my basic read on where the LCWR thing is going under Francis, I think the dialogue between the Committee of Bishops that's been set up in the LCWR will continue. And I think that will eventually end up back in with the Congregation for the Faith in Rome in terms of signing off on whatever resolution is reached. But I think that the spirit in Rome, particularly once it gets to the Pope's desk, is likely to be discernibly more sort of generous, to pick a word, than perhaps some of the women religious have experienced it up to this point. Yes, sir.
I think it's changing now, but I grew up in a clerical church. And I'm talking about in terms of vocation or calling. Vatican II says the principal calling, the first calling, is to holiness. A call within a call, this is not Vatican II. This call within a call is the marriage, religious life, laity, dedicated laity, single person. How does that come out in terms of the global church?
Okay, so the question is, one of the core ideas of Vatican II was that the fundamental call in the church is the call to holiness, which then, in a kind of secondary moment, is expressed either in marriage or the calling to the priesthood or in the religious life or whatever. And so how does this sort of empowerment of the laity, so to speak, how does that play out in the global church? First of all, it depends on what we're talking about. I mean, bear in mind, when we talk about the church in the developing world, we're talking about a pool of 740 million people. Now, you show me one thing that can meaningfully be said that would apply equally to 740 million people, and I've got a bridge in Brooklyn I would like to sell you, So these generalizations are dangerous. But let me say, in general, I think there is a kind of strong sense of the need to reconceptualize the role of the laity from being kind of passive consumers of religious services to being the kind of lead apostles and missionaries of the church that is true across the developing world. And in part, that's because of the theology of Vatican II or whatever, but I think it's even more a result of simple math. I mean, here's a basic thing that people often don't appreciate. We in the United States may occasionally complain about a priest shortage. Do you know what the ratio of priests to baptized Catholics in this country is? It's 1 to 1,300. We have one priest for every 1,300 baptized Catholics in the United States. Do you know what it is in sub-Saharan Africa? It's 1 to 5,500. Do you know what it is in Latin America? It's 1 to 7,800. Do you know what it is in Southeast Asia? It's 1 to 8,300. Now, you might ask yourself, well, how does that square with the phenomenal growth of the church in the developing world? And aren't they generating, tons of vocations? Well, here's the thing, folks. Rapid growth in the church is a prescription for a worsening priest shortage, not a better one, because we can baptize people much more rapidly than we can ordain them. Okay? So when a church is growing dramatically, its clergy shortage is always going to worsen. Okay? And by the way, this is a footnote. This is not exactly the question you asked, but we're going to have to deal with this reality at some point, because we in the West, and particularly in the United States, I think sometimes we are tempted to think that importing vocations from the developing world is the solution to our own priest shortage. Okay, that is bringing in new priests from Africa or the Philippines or wherever, India. the truth of the matter, and believe me, I mean, I think those guys are a godsend, and we should be on our knees thanking the good Lord for providing them to us. But at the end of the day, there's a real question in justice here. Because in effect, what we are doing is plundering the best and brightest of the church and the developing world in order to meet our own perceived pastoral needs, when the truth of it is these guys are much more desperately needed back home than they are here. Okay, so we're going to have to reckon with that. But in any event, my own read would be, I don't know too many Catholic bishops or theologians or just rank-and-file folks across the developing world for whom this issue of how do we light a fire under the laity and sort of pass the baton to them to be our missionaries, I don't know too many people in the developing world for whom that would not be a front-burner priority, right? I mean, look, you know, I gave you the numbers about all the defections from Catholicism to Protestantism, particularly the Pentecostals in Latin America. You know, the Latin American bishops, when they came together in 2007 in Aparecida, the last time they gathered as a continent-wide body, they adopted a document, the Aparecida document, the very top note of which is precisely this idea of trying to reframe the laity as the frontline carriers of the Church's apostolic mission, and the clerical caste then as a kind of support system to the work that the laity are doing. By the way, lead author of that document, an Argentine bishop by the name of Jorge Mario Bergoglio, okay, who today, of course, is the Pope. And I think a large part of it simply was, it was out of 30 years of experience of watching a heavily clericalist church lose an ever greater share of its people to religious competitors who are not heavily clericalist. Okay? I mean, if I can put this in really crass terms, and I'm not saying this is how most people think, but I mean, just to bring the point home, okay? If I can use militarist language for a moment, I think the experience of Latin America and much of the developing world is that if it's going to be a contest between our clergy and their laity, we are locked in an arms race we are destined to lose. Okay? And I think that has brought home in a very practical way the need to kind of revitalize, re-embrace, and make real that kind of Vatican II vision about the lay role. Okay. Let's see. Yes?
I think it's Chef Hugh in Philadelphia who made a comment recently about, after reading the interview with Pope Francis, about how he thinks something that Francis is going to need to do now is to sort of recapture those new evangelization folks in the West, in the U.S. and elsewhere, who might sort of feel isolated by at least the slant the media has taken on its reasoning.
You don't happen to remember where you read that, do you? Yeah. Brilliant, breathtaking. You know, somebody, I will let you ask your question, but you know, a friend of mine once explained this is the difference between print and TV, okay? In print, people remember what you wrote, but not that you wrote it, okay? So people will constantly say to you, oh, I read this fascinating piece the other day, and you have to remind them, you know, that was my piece. Really? Yeah. Whereas on TV, people remember that you were on TV, but not a damn thing that you said. So I'm constantly running into people who said, I saw you during the conclave. You looked cold. Anyway, go ahead.
So my question would just be, how much priority do you think that will be for Francis, especially in light of this wider sense that whether in the U.S. or abroad, we really need to sort of have a discipleship model of how the laity are formed and sort of the front lines of evangelization, that you wouldn't want to lose this.
Yeah. You know, there's this famous, did you all get the question? I mean, the question was, Archbishop Chaput of Philadelphia in an interview in July at World Youth Day with me in Brazil, and he said this in other places. But in the interview I did with him in Brazil, said that, that early on, the early reaction to Francis was there were some in what we might loosely call the conservative wing of the church who were ambivalent or worried, and that Francis was going to have to maybe work a little harder to bring those people along with wherever he wanted to go, which I think descriptively is a perfectly fair statement. Okay? So the question then was, you know, is that something Francis is going to have to work on? Yeah, you know, John the 23rd, there are a lot of apocryphal things attributed to John the 23rd that I'm not sure he actually ever said. One of those apocryphal statements was, he supposedly once said that I have to be the Pope, both of those with their foot on the gas and those with their foot on the brake. Okay? You know, meaning a Pope has to be conscious of being a Pope of the whole church and not just a faction or a camp, you know, inside the church. Francis is a very politically astute guy. I mean, you know, he will be aware of that. I mean, part of the reason, you know, one of the breaking Vatican news from today, by the way, in case you missed it, is that they officially confirmed the date for the canonizations of John the 23rd and John Paul II. It's going to be April 27th, 2014, which of course is Divine Mercy Sunday, first Sunday after Easter. I think one of the reasons that Francis wanted to canonize these two figures together rather than doing it separately is because he knows that in church politics, however artificial this is, and frankly I think you can make a great case this is terribly artificial, but the politics of the church are John Paul is a hero to the right and John the 23rd is a hero to the left. Okay? Truth is, both guys were way more complicated than that, but I mean, that's how things often play out. Okay? And I think Francis wanted to make a statement about unity precisely by canonizing them together, saying these two figures belong together, and that any attempt to separate them is artificial. Okay? Every pope, in a way, has his natural constituency, and every pope, in a way, has people he has to try to reach out to, you know, who maybe for whom this pope is an acquired taste. I actually think Benedict, and listen, I mean, I have to tell you, I knew Cardinal Ratzinger for 15 years before he was elected pope, and of course I covered his 8-year papacy. I'm feeling tremendously protective of him these days because it drives me nuts to no end that a lot of the things that people are singing hosannas about over Pope Francis actually began under Benedict. I mean, you know, the financial reform of the Vatican, that'll begin under him. You know, the reforms on the sex abuse stuff, which Francis really hasn't done much on. I mean, there were historic reforms that began under Benedict, but even down to stylistic things, okay? Like this idea of a humbler, simpler papacy. Yeah, I mean, Benedict liked the ermine and lace, I'll give you that. But, you know, I was there 3 days after his election when he went to his old apartment in the Piazza Leonina, packed his own bag, and imported it himself back to the Apostolic Palace, and before he left, went around and knocked on the doors of all the other apartments in this building to thank the nuns who did the cooking and cleaning for being such great neighbors. Something that I've never seen any other senior churchman ever do. Okay, so, I mean, I think Ratzinger doesn't get nearly enough credit on many fronts. And I think his efforts over 8 years to try to reach beyond what he certainly was smart enough to know was his natural base are part of that. I mean, you know, his first encyclical, Deus Caritas Est, which was, I mean, in the abstract, if you had said that Joseph Ratzinger is going to write his first encyclical on sexual morality, what would you have expected? I think the stereotype would be we would have expected a kind of fire and brimstone, finger-wagging exercise about the evils of abortion and contraception in the West. Instead, we get this, you know, poetic treatment of human love as an icon of divine love. I mean, it was really quite remarkable. And I think it was not accidental that that was his first encyclical. I think he was trying to send a signal that, you know, for 20 years I had to be the Dr. No of the Catholic Church. Now I would like to be the Pope of yes. And I think in many ways he tried to do that for 8 years. He unfortunately ran headlong into a media narrative that was just never going to let him off the hook for his past. Okay? Now, Bergoglio, Pope Francis, has the great advantage that he didn't arrive in the papacy with a narrative. He had the luxury of framing his own narrative, okay? And he's done it quite artfully. But I do think, like every pope, there are some constituencies in the church that he's going to have to work to make sure are not left behind. And I would say two in particular come to mind, okay? One, the most ardent pro-lifers in the church, who I think felt to some extent let down by the Pope's recent interview with Jesuit publications in which, you know, I mean, the kind of media takeaway from that all is, we don't really need to talk about this stuff anymore, you know, and I think that constituency is probably going to need some tender loving care from the Pope. I think the other would be the more kind of traditionally minded, you know, liturgical folk out there. Who have been concerned with some of the stuff they've seen. And I think Francis, you know, look, he's not going to compromise his principle, and he's not going to shrink from trying to reorient the church somewhat. But I do think along the way he's going to be conscious of, I mean, if he wants to be a pope of unity, then he should not be creating new divisions. And I think he's going to want to be conscious of trying to, in whatever way he can, that's consistent with his overall vision, trying to reach out to those crowds. Can I say, every pope, you know, has people for whom that pope is their cup of tea, and some who aren't. But I think at the end of the day, popes are profoundly, at least certainly the three I've covered, have been profoundly conscious of trying to be the pope of the whole church and not just a party. Yes?
God, I was moved by your description of Christians all over the world. What can a place place like Notre Dame, with really talented students and excellent faculty, and the center in Jerusalem and Rome, and lots of other centers all over, what can a place like Notre Dame do about that?
Okay, so the question is, what can a place about Notre Dame do about persecuted Christians? Well, the first thing I would say is talk about it. I mean, show of hands, those statistics I just gave you, 80% of all acts of religious persecution in the world are directed against Christians. Christians are persecuted in 3/4 of the countries on earth, 100,000 Christians killed every year. How many of you was that news to you? There's your answer. I mean, I don't think a student should be able to graduate from 4 years at Notre Dame without knowing that stuff. I could say more, but I mean, there you got it. Quickly, I mean, just to bring that point home, I mean, because this is an obvious question. Every time I have a whole presentation on the war on Christians, and the real war on Christians, and every time I talk about it, this is obviously the pragmatic, practical American question, right? What can we do? And of course, we typically frame that in terms of, well, what policy should we be pushing for? Where should we be giving money, right? You know, where can we put, you know, boots on the ground to try to help people out? And these, listen, I mean, these are all things worth thinking about. But let me tell you, when I ask persecuted Christians themselves that question, and I recently I was with a group of Syrian refugees who were in Rome just a couple weeks ago. Okay, these are Syrian Catholic refugees who have had to flee the country, and they've ended up in Rome. And I will ask them this question, you know, what can we do? You know what the first thing they always tell me is, the first thing they always say before they get to anything specific is, don't forget about us. Don't forget about us, because they have this profound sense that we don't care. You know, we're not paying attention. And that often can be a kind of make or break psychological variable in a Christian in some part of the world deciding whether it's worth it to try to stick it out or not. I mean, if they feel that they've been abandoned and cut loose and left to their own devices, then the decision to immigrate is often a lot easier to make, right? So the first thing I would do is say, what Notre Dame can do is create a culture of consciousness in which there is a palpable concern for persecuted Christians that permeates this place. Right? Start with that. I think everything else will fall into place. I mean, listen, you have got an unbelievably creative community here. When the community at Notre Dame turns its mind to something in some kind of systematic way, it will find the solutions. Okay, the first thing to do is create a culture in which you're thinking about this at all. How are we doing in time?
One more question.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Well, on the same subject, I was listening to a religious Jewish commentator on the radio, and he is asking, why aren't the Christians demonstrating?
Mm-hmm.
Why aren't there marches? Why isn't there a march on Washington? We can't tolerate this persecution of Christians. Just, I mean, for one thing, like you're saying, to bring it to the forefront, to put it out there. I mean, there's a little blip sometimes on the news, but...
Well, look, I mean, we are up against, in trying to mobilize... Well, first of all, the question you were asking is exactly the right one, which is, why don't we react the same way that members of other religious traditions do when their members are targeted, okay? I think there are a lot of reasons, but one of them is many Christians in the West have assimilated this kind of anachronistic model that Christians are the oppressor rather than the oppressed. I mean, I think you stop the average person in the West and you say religious persecution, what they're going to think about are the Crusades and the Inquisition and Galileo and the Salem witch trials and on and on and on, okay? And all of those things are, in fact, features of our history. But here are some basic facts. 2/3, as I told you, 2/3 of the Christians in the world today live outside the West. The majority are impoverished. The majority are women. The majority are members of ethnic, linguistic, and cultural minorities, so they are often doubly or triply stigmatized. That's why they're in the firing line, right? So this old model that we are the ones, that Christians are the ones who are perpetrating oppression, doesn't do, and now, of course, there are isolated cases, but it doesn't do justice to the actual reality of the 21st century, which is much more often we are the oppressed. I mean, in a soundbite, I usually say, we're not living on the pages of a Dan Brown novel, okay, in which Christians are dispatching mad assassins to settle their scores. We are instead the ones against whom mad assassins are being dispatched. Okay, that's the reality of our situation. Frankly, look at the back cover of my new book. Okay, the back cover of my new book says it's time to wake up. It's the bottom line. It is time to wake up. I mean, we have slept through this story for far too long. And we need, and not out of confessional self-interest, okay? But because people's lives are in the balance, and frankly, if we don't do something on their behalf, then I would ask you, who else is going to? Okay? Listen, since they're pulling the plug, let me say one last thing before I go, which is I want this to be the beginning of a conversation among us and not the end. So let me make you this offer. I have an online column. It's called All Things Catholic. If you just Google, like John Allen, All Things Catholic, you'll find it. My email address is at the bottom, and I do answer that email. So if there's ever any way I can be of help to someone in this room, and I don't really know what that would be, you know, but I don't know, if you know, you're in a graduate seminar someplace and a question comes up you think I might be able to help you with, or, I mean, for God's sakes, people, if you're coming to Rome and you want restaurant recommendations, okay? You know, this is where I really shine. And yes, folks, it is a real burden of my office that so much of it is done over lengthy Italian meals, but I want you to know I'm over there carrying the cross for all of you. However I can help, whatever it would be, you know, please be in touch with me. And listen, this would not be a burden. I mean, if I mean what I say, that we need to get past these kind of, you know, internal divisions in the church, and we need to create a new culture of common cause. If I mean that, then obviously I need to walk my own talk. So if I can be of help to you, it would not be an imposition. It would be a chance to feel like a person of integrity. Okay, so take advantage of it. Thank you. God bless you. Viva Our Lady.